everybody, and welcome back to our lecture today. Today I want to talk about work and retirement. It's a pretty important part of our lives, and we spend clearly a huge proportion of our lives engaging in work activities of a variety of kinds. If you think of all the different jobs you've had and as college students, the jobs or the career you are preparing for, you can imagine that this is a pretty important subject. When we look at the theory underlying work, there's several that I want to talk about. And I want to begin with Super's theory of career development. Basically, this theory is that we develop our careers in stages, and the idea here is that these five distinct career stages, they're not fixed and they're not necessarily exactly the same for everybody. We go back and forth. The research clearly shows that very rarely will any of us have just one career. That the latest data show that people change jobs every 5 years on average. And again, those jobs may be in the same general career path, but we also should point out that people change actual careers. They do one thing for a while and then switch over. And some of you perhaps are in college and you've had one career or job for a while and you're in the process of switching over. The five career stages that Super talks about are, first of all, growth, then exploration, then establishment, then maintenance, and finally disengagement. So imagine for yourself that you have decided growing up that you want to be a nurse, and that decision clearly means some training and some activities that allow you to get into the nursing field, credentialing, and so on and so forth. And once you get in, let's say you go to college, you get a nursing degree, you get your RN or BSN. And so this first stage, which is growth, is that initially in any career, we are going to have to pay attention and learn. In other words, gather experience, gather hands-on active engagement in doing the career. And so the first stage, the growth one, in some ways is getting up to speed with regard to doing whatever career you've chosen better. And that stage goes into the second one, which is exploration. Once you have a basic handle on this career, there's all kinds of possibilities and directions for you to go. So if I could use my own example of being a college professor, so I trained and then I finally got a job, and I had to spend the first couple of years of your life working very, very hard on preparing the various classes that I needed to teach, and how am I going to do testing, and how am I going to lecture, and am I going to use PowerPoint, and so on and so forth, the growth. Then once the exploration came out, and I had the basic competency levels, now what? Am I going to specialize in this area of psychology? Do I want to seek to be the department chair? Do I want to seek to move into teaching online courses or on-campus courses? So exploration would just be within the context of the career. What are the various ways in which I can pursue perhaps a more specialized niche in the career? That would be the exploration. And finally, the third one would be establishment. This is where I've established what I'm going to do. Basically, there may be growth within this. As a professor, I may move to assistant professor and then associate professor and then full professor. But I'm establishing myself and credentialing myself and developing experiences which, if you will, follow up on the growth and exploration stages, but which really solidify me into the career. And then the maintenance would just be, once I do that, depending upon how long I'm planning to do this, I just maintain. In other words, I just do, hopefully well, what I've set out to do. And again, sometimes I may go back to the exploration phase. I may say that I've been a college professor. Now I'm going to see that if I can maybe move up and be a dean. And so I go back to, if you will, the growth and exploration. So it's not as if this is a one unidirectional arc and line, but maintenance would be I continue to do my job. And then finally, when we get toward the end, as I look to perhaps retirement or as I look to switching careers completely, becomes the disengagement. I'm 60 years old, if you've been listening to these lectures, you know, and so I have no desire or plan to retire anytime soon. But as I look toward the future, clearly I don't have 30 years of teaching left, maybe 10 or 15 or so. But my attitude toward my job changes. Maybe I seek to slowly ramp down or specialize, but I'm in some ways approaching the time in which I'm going to disconnect. So Super's, I think, theory of career development is helpful. And Super points out that our career decisions and our careers clearly are not isolated from all of the other aspects of our lives, from our relationships and perhaps marriage relationships and parenting and larger family and buying a house or moving here or moving there. So all of these stages are sometimes hugely impacted. You know, I may be in the maintenance part of my career, and all of a sudden I get laid off, and I can't find another job in that career. And let's say that I lose my teaching job for whatever reason, and there's no teaching jobs available. Well, at that point, I may have to go back and say, well, I'm going to work at Home Depot now, or I'm going to, become a police officer or something like that. So think of Super's stages as circular rather than linear in terms of the various changes and potential career changes that we'll go through. And this brings up clearly some gender differences with regard to career patterns. We know, so for instance, that men and women work, everybody works, but with regard to career, in other words, paid career, the proportion of men working as opposed to women working is higher. So when we look at data, and this data obviously changes, approximately 70% of adult men are in full-time work, whereas the percentage of women is somewhere a little lower than 60%, 57, 58% in there. And there's good reasons for this, and a lot of those reasons really center on family life and raising children. I know it's 2020s, we're in the 2020s, and but the reality is there still is gender differences when it comes to family and who works. Men do tend to stay in full-time jobs longer, and let's face it, because if you're a father and you have a family, for better or for worse, sometimes, not always, the burden of providing for that family falls on the man. That doesn't always have to be true, and there are many cases when it's not, but we're making generalizations here. And indeed, for a couple, both of which work when children come along, it is just much more likely that the woman involved is going to go from a full-time to a part-time job if that choice is to be made. And so there are ongoing gender differences and just the biological and social factors that come in with regard to childbearing, child rearing. It may not be exactly fair, but child rearing responsibilities do tend to fall much more on women than on men. That's the way it goes. So if you look at this figure, you can see that the top line would be men from the 70s up until the middle of 2015. And you can see that there was a small, the line goes down a little bit for men, and that's because the population is slowly aging. And the line for women, clearly, as societal changes have happened, as more and more women have gone to college and preparing for careers, that arc is going up. But with regard to percentages, it's hard to imagine that the women's line in full-time work will ever go higher than the men's line. Now, in terms of theories of career selection, I want to talk about John Holland here in a second, but let's go to James Marcia. Marcia says that there are basically four what he calls aspects of career selection, and these four stages are diffusion, foreclosure, moratorium, and commitment. And I'm going to let you read about these, but they simply are how we go about picking a career. Some of you may be right in the middle of this as college students, wanting to pick a career. If I could use my daughter, who's 31, as an example, she went to college as a music and graphic design major and graduated with that, and then quickly figured out that in order to make a career of graphic design, she, to use her evaluation, wasn't committed and talented enough to make a career of that. And so while she had trained for that, she decided she was going to figure things out, and then got two part-time jobs to make a living. And one was working at a church as a part-time junior high youth pastor. And the second one was working at an animal hospital. And as she did those two jobs part-time just to try and figure things out, she decided she was going to be a vet. And that, of course, necessitated huge amounts of change. She had to go back to college and get 66 credits of science, chemistry, and anatomy and physiology in order even to apply for vet school. So she did that. That took a lot of time. Another 2 or 3 years of undergraduate, and then applied to vet school and then started vet school. That took 4 years. So essentially, it's not a straight line for most people. We pick a major in college and we train for that, but doesn't necessarily mean that once we get in the job, we'll stick with this. And so Marcia's stages of diffusion, foreclosure, moratorium, and commitment really speak to those processes in eventually getting to that commitment stage, which is settling on a career. And again, we have to point out that whether you're a male or a female, your career choice is not for everybody, but at least going to be informed by this. For better or for worse, when we have freedom to choose what we want to do in life, generally speaking, our gender has a lot to say about that. Again, this is a generalization, but men in general prefer to engage in activities that relate to things, objects, whereas women prefer to engage in careers that relate to people. Now, that's not true for everybody. There are certainly women who become engineers. There are men who become psychologists. But gender differences do inform our career choices, and the net effect of this is that we tend to sort ourselves, according to male and female, into certain careers. Now, maybe 20 years ago, a lot of this gender separation was thought to be the process of socialization. In other words, girls were socialized to want to be or to be encouraged to go into careers like teaching and nursing and so on and so forth, and men into careers that involved, fixing cars or objects. But subsequent research over the last 20 years shows that when we have complete freedom of choice, that we actually are more likely to segregate ourselves into gender-specific careers. And that's been an interesting change in our perception. So, for instance, when you look at the Scandinavian countries, Sweden and Norway and Denmark and so on and so forth, probably of all the countries in the world, these countries have devoted themselves to being as gender neutral as possible. And indeed, when we look at those countries, we find that the greater proportion, for instance, of nurses is female than in other cultures. So the effects of gender on career selection isn't just socialization. We don't want to say it has nothing to do with that, but there seems to be different things that men and women are interested in doing, and those tend to be at least somewhat influenced by gender. So here's Holland's 6 basic types of vocational interests, and it's kind of interesting that when you go around in the circle here, so for instance, if we start at the top, realistic, these would be people that are prefer to work with their hands. They prefer to use tools to build, repair, grow things. They want to engage in realistic, actual day-to-day activities. Going to the right, to the investigative, these are people, again, that prefer to work on their own. They prefer to try and figure things out. They love observing, investigating, solving problems. This may be in science, or it may be as a detective. Going down to the next one, to the right, is artistic people. These are people that are creatively inclined. They're innovative. They love using their imagination, and they're innovative. Social. These are people who clearly enjoy working with other people, training and helping and teaching. They don't want to be involved in machinery. Enterprising individuals are people that like to lead and manage people, and they like to see the big picture. They're more focused upon understanding on a macro level as opposed to a micro level. And then finally, conventional. These are people who like to work with specifically words and numbers, like an accountant. They're very focused on the details, the specifics, but not in terms of working with their hands, but rather working with their mind. So Holland's 6 basic vocational types are quite interesting because they really speak to the fact of our interest, and then finding a career or a job which reflects that interest.